We want to look at the concept of faith in some detail, and the material we're looking at here is in the book by Feingold, but it's important to get a good grasp on this understanding of faith, because this theologically nuanced understanding of faith is probably a little bit different than our normal conception of faith or our colloquial way of speaking of faith. And this is definitely different than an understanding of faith that the secular world will have. We're going to look first at human faith as kind of an analogy, an everyday analogy for what we'll then look at with supernatural faith. And again, I think this is an important concept because, as Feingold says, there's been a category shift when it comes to understanding the concept of faith. He says, the modern secular world tends increasingly to view Christian faith as principally sentiment rather than light, right? Sentiment, that is, feeling or emotion. It has less to do with understanding or reason and more to do simply with sentiment, emotion, sentimentality. He says faith has undergone a drastic category shift from being understood as a virtue which perfects the intellect to know supernatural truths. It's seen rather as a pure option of the will to help one get through life. That is, a pure option of the will. I simply choose to believe without any rational basis. If we were to ask someone of this kind, well, why do you believe? It's simply, I just do. And this idea is that it helps one get through life. It's practically helpful. He says, as such, it can be tolerated, perhaps within the confines of the church, but must be banished from any influence in the public square. And this makes sense, and I think this is what we're seeing, that if religion and faith is not seen to be based on any kind of reasonableness or rationality at all, well then it's simply sentiment, opinion, and really needs to be segregated from the rest of public life. So we want to ask, well, what is this conception of faith then, if it's not one of mere sentiment or a pure option of the will? Well, we can look first at the nature of faith in general. And in this sense, we're bracketing off completely faith in the supernatural sense. We're not talking about faith in the Trinity or faith in the Incarnation. This is simply how we come to know things in the world around us on a daily basis. So we'll get to supernatural faith. This is just faith in a much more general sense. And we want to define faith in this sense as a firm assent of the mind to things unseen. So there's a few parts to this definition. It's a firm assent of the mind. That is, it's an act of the intellect. The intellect is the part of us that knows truth. And an assent, when you hear that word assent, it's simply the yes, the intellect's yes, right? So for instance, when somebody tells me the sky is blue and I look up and I see the sky is blue, my intellect assents to the truth that the sky is blue. And I say yes to that truth. So it's an act of the intellect, this assent, but it's a firm assent. There's a kind of certainty that comes with this notion of faith. It's not merely opinion, it's not merely maybe, maybe not, but the kind of assent that the intellect gives is a firm one. But it's a firm assent of the mind, and here's an important part, to things unseen. The object of faith is unseen. When I look up and see that the sky is blue, we're not talking about faith here because that's something seen. The object is seen. When it comes to faith in this general sense, the object has to be something unseen. So we want to talk about what does it mean for an object to be unseen. Well, first we have to ask, what is a seen object? And Feingold points out that an object can be seen in two ways. The first is by the senses, empirically observed. So I've got a water bottle here. Just as I could look up in the sky and see it's blue, I could also look at my water bottle and say, there's a water bottle. So I know that by my senses, right? Empirically observed. I see it. So an object can be seen in that way. An object can also be seen not by the five senses, but by the mind. And Feingold gives us the examples of things that are necessarily true, like first principles of reason. And here he means such basic things that we don't even very often think about them. Things like the principle of non-contradiction, that a thing can't be and not be in the same way at the same time, right? Or the principle of identity. A thing is the same as itself, right? These are so basic that they are necessarily true, that once our mind understands the very words, we naturally know they're true. We don't need to see something like that. Another example is that the parts are never greater than the whole of anything, right? As soon as we know what we mean by parts and whole, the mind doesn't need to go see. We don't need to go see empirically with our senses parts and wholes. We simply know that the parts are never greater than the whole. He also says all those things that are logically deduced or inferred from evident principles through the process of reason are also known or seen by the mind. These would be things like the further principles of mathematics that are deduced from the first principles. So he's saying we can see objects, or objects are seen in these two ways, by our five senses and then by the mind, things that are necessarily true. When something is seen by the mind, the intellect naturally and spontaneously assents to the truth. When I'm holding my water bottle in my hand, my mind spontaneously and naturally assents, says yes to the truth that there is a water bottle in my hand. When I look at the sky and see it's blue, my intellect naturally and spontaneously assents, says yes to the truth that the sky is blue. When I understand the concepts of parts and wholes, my intellect doesn't need to I don't need to choose to believe that. My intellect simply naturally and spontaneously assents to it. And that's because the intrinsic evidence of the object, the evidence within the object itself, naturally causes the assent of the intellect. There's something in the object itself that brings us to that assent. In the case of the sky being blue, it's seeing that the sky is blue. In the case of necessary truths, like a thing is identical with itself, it's part of the truth that there's that intrinsic evidence within the object. So the intellect then spontaneously and naturally assents to those kinds of truths. But what about an unseen object? What do we mean by that? Well, an object is unseen if it's neither empirically observed nor self-evident or deduced from the evidence. And I'll give you a very easy example. I've never been to Alaska, right? So I've never empirically observed Alaska. I've never been there. I've never set foot there. I've never seen it. But the fact of Alaska's existence is not self-evident. It's not deduced from self-evident principles. And yet, so that means that the existence of Alaska, if I say Alaska exists, that object is unseen to me in these ways, right? But notice I naturally, I wouldn't say naturally, I have assented quite firmly to the fact that Alaska exists. So where does that assent come from is the question. So when do we assent to things that are unseen? When the object is unseen, the intellect does not assent naturally and spontaneously, right? It's not like the sky is blue. It's something different. But we can freely choose to assent to the unseen object or not. See, the intellect doesn't do it automatically, but we can freely choose to do that. When the object is unseen, the assent needs to be chosen because the object by itself is insufficient to bring that assent forth. There's no intrinsic reason bringing that forth, so the will has to choose it. So, this free assent of the intellect requires another cause in addition to the object, right? When it's seen objects, the object itself is enough to move the intellect to assent. But for unseen objects, there has to be another cause. And in this case, assent to something unseen happens if and only if the will commands it. Now remember, the intellect is what knows the truth, assents to the truth, but the will is that faculty in the person that chooses the good, right? The free will. So the will, given proper motive, can command or move the intellect to assent. So this assent, if the motive for assent is uncertain, then the resulting act is called opinion. So if there's something that moves me to assent, you know what, my will chooses to believe, to assent to something, to say yes, but I'm not really sure, that the motive isn't quite strong enough. I have an opinion. Maybe, maybe not. But if the motive is so strong that the assent is firm, then the resulting act is called faith. And notice this would be the case with me in Alaska. Alaska is not seen to me, it's unseen, but I do have motive, and we still have to ask what that is, but I have motive, and that motive is so strong that my assent is firm. I don't wonder whether or not Alaska exists. I'm quite firm in that and quite confident. So we can call that faith. Now, this might be a little different use of the word faith than we're used to. We might use something like belief, but we're going to see that this translates with some modification, some significant modification into supernatural faith. The motive for assenting to the unseen. So what is it that would be a proper motive for my will to command my intellect to assent to something unseen? Normally, the firmness of the act of faith is motivated by the testimony of a witness who is judged to be sufficiently credible and who claims to have seen or sees what for the believer remains unseen. All this means is, why do I believe that Alaska exists without seeing it and without it being a necessary truth? Because proper witnesses who I've judged to be sufficiently credible have testified to it. I've read about Alaska in books. I've seen it in documentaries. I've seen it in National Geographic magazine. My brother visited there. So there's this confluence of different witnesses that I've judged to be credible. In particular, my brother, because he's a credible person, right? Because of their testimony, that's enough motive for my will to command my intellect to assent quite firmly to the fact that Alaska exists. And this is what we would call human faith. I have faith that Alaska exists. The firm assent, notice, is not arbitrary. It's not without reason, right? It's motivated by the authority of a witness that I have some reason to trust. It's not simply because. It is actually motivated by good motives. Faith, therefore, in this human sense that we use all the day, can be defined as assent, not moved by the intrinsic evidence of truths, but rather by a firm impulse of the will based on a sufficiently credible witness. In the act of faith, the intellect assents to a given truth because the will chooses to do so on account of motives of credibility judged to be weighty. Now, that term, motives of credibility, we're going to have a whole class on what exactly that is when it comes to matters of religious faith. But again, notice this. Faith can be defined as assent not moved by the intrinsic evidence of the truths. There's nothing, I haven't seen Alaska. There's nothing necessarily true that Alaska exists. But I have a firm impulse of my will. I choose based on credible witnesses who have told me that Alaska exists. And I have reason to believe that they're credible because of these motives of credibility that we'll look at in another class. And notice, every rational person chooses to make acts of human faith very frequently, and we can't live without doing so. A tremendous amount of what we believe is based on the testimony of others, from teachers, from parents, from the media, from our reading, from friends. A huge amount of what we believe is not seen by our five senses or necessary truths. So we can conclude this by saying that there's a little bit of a difference between faith, scientific demonstration, and mere opinion. Faith in general is an act midway between scientific demonstration and mere opinion, because the essence of faith is that one does not directly see the intrinsic reason for the truth of a given proposition. In that sense, it's like opinion, right? This faith is like an opinion because it's not the seen object that moves me to assent to its truth, but it's different from mere opinion in its certitude, in its firm assent. Right? So the fact that faith assents to the unseen makes it like opinion, but the fact that faith is certain or is a firm assent means that it's unlike opinion. It has a stronger assent. So given this idea of faith in the human sense, we're going to ask, how can that be used as a basis for understanding faith in supernatural mysteries that we come to in our Catholic faith? And we'll look at that next.